What breaks your heart can also heal it. The smallest hands often carry the biggest hearts. Thomas Langley was a broken man who had given up on kindness until he watched a 6-year-old girl empty her pockets to save a dying dog. The little girl had only $5 to her name, but she gave every penny without hesitation. Thomas saw her kneeling in the street, placing those crumpled bills in a jar marked "Vet Help," with complete faith that someone would notice. He was supposed to call animal control and walk away. Instead, he did something that surprised even himself. He stepped outside and paid for the dog's surgery. What started as one man's simple act of decency became something much more powerful. The girl, the golden retriever, and the lonely bookstore owner formed an unlikely family that would change each of their lives. But when they discovered the dog's mysterious past, they uncovered a truth that would test everything they believed. About second chances. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through dust motes dancing above stacks of forgotten books, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor of Langley's antique books. Thomas Langley stood at the window of his second-floor apartment, coffee growing, cold in his weathered hands, watching the world wake up below him on Maple Street. At 67, his routine had become as predictable as the sunrise itself. Wake at 6, coffee by 6:15, open the shop by 8, close by 5, dinner alone by 6:30, sleep by 10. 5 years of the same pattern every single day. The leather armchair by the window remained empty, positioned exactly where Margaret used to sit each morning with her tea and whatever novel had captured her attention that week. Thomas couldn't bring himself to move it, couldn't bear to sit in it himself. The burgundy leather had faded slightly where her back used to rest, and sometimes, in the early morning light, he could almost see her there again. Auburn hair catching the sunbeams, green eyes sparkling with whatever literary discovery she'd made the night before. Margaret had been gone for 5 years, 2 months and 16 days. Not that Thomas was counting. The cancer had taken her slowly, giving them time to say everything that needed saying and then some. She'd made him promise to keep living, to find purpose again, to maybe even find love if the right person came along. Thomas had nodded and held her hand and made promises he had no intention of keeping. Some wounds were meant to stay open. His reflection in the window showed a man who'd let himself go, grey beard gone slightly wild, shoulders that had once been military straight now curved inward, like he was protecting something precious in his chest. The neighbors probably saw him as the gruff old widower who barely spoke when they passed him on the street. Mrs. Henderson from next door had stopped bringing casseroles after the first year when it became clear Thomas wasn't interested in neighborly comfort. The bookstore below had been Margaret's dream as much as his. She'd spent her last good months helping him arrange the sections, classic literature near the front window where the light was best, mysteries along the back wall, children's books in the cozy corner with the small chairs she'd insisted they needed. Children need stories, she'd said, especially the lost ones. Thomas had kept everything exactly as she'd organized it, though precious few children had wandered in over the years. He'd opened the shop after retiring early from his job at the Veterans Hospital. 30 years as a trauma counselor, helping soldiers piece their lives back together after coming home from places that changed them. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd been better at fixing other people's broken pieces than his own. The nightmares from his own service in Vietnam had never fully left, but Margaret's presence had made them bearable. Without her, they'd returned with a vengeance. The morning ritual continued as it always did. Thomas descended the narrow staircase that connected his apartment to the shop, his knees protesting slightly more each year. The familiar smell of old paper and binding glue greeted him, a scent that had once brought comfort, but now felt more like a museum of his past life. He unlocked the front door, flipped the sign from closed to open, and began the day's familiar dance of avoiding human interaction while ostensibly running a business that required it. Most days brought maybe 3 or 4 customers, the regulars, who knew to expect silence and minimal help unless specifically asked. Mrs. Chen, the retired librarian who came in twice a week looking for historical biographies. Young Mr. Phillips, who collected first-edition science fiction novels and never minded that Thomas barely acknowledged his presence. The college students, who occasionally wandered in looking for assigned reading, usually leaving empty-handed when they discovered Thomas didn't carry contemporary textbooks. Thomas preferred it this way, the quiet, the predictability, the blessed absence of expectations. He'd arranged his life to require as little human connection as possible. Groceries delivered weekly, bills paid automatically, doctor's appointments scheduled reluctantly and only when absolutely necessary. He'd become a ghost, haunting his own existence, and most days that felt safer than the alternative. The morning passed as usual. Inventory counted, dust wiped from shelves, a few phone calls about book availability answered with minimal words. Around 10:30, Mrs. Chen arrived looking for something about the Civil War. Thomas directed her to the history section with a nod and returned to his position behind the counter, where he could see the street through the front window. That's when the commotion began. It started with the screech of brakes and a sickening thud that made Thomas's blood run cold, a sound he'd heard too many times in too many places. Through the window, he saw a small grey sedan speeding away, its driver apparently unwilling to deal with whatever they'd just hit. In the street lay a golden shape that wasn't moving. Thomas's first instinct was to reach for the phone and call animal control. Quick, efficient, someone else's problem. But before he could move, a small figure appeared from seemingly nowhere, running toward the injured animal with the kind of fearless determination that only children possess. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old, all pigtails and patched overalls, dropping to her knees beside the wounded dog, without a moment's hesitation. From his window, Thomas could see her small hands moving gently over the animal's fur, checking for injuries with the careful attention of someone who'd done this before. The dog, a golden retriever Thomas could see now, lifted its head slightly at her touch, tail giving the faintest wag, despite what must have been considerable pain. The girl stood up and ran back toward the sidewalk, disappearing momentarily, before returning with what looked like a small first aid kit and a glass jar. Thomas watched, transfixed despite himself, as she began trying to stop the bleeding from the dog's leg, her movements careful and purposeful. She was talking to the animal in a voice too quiet for Thomas to hear through the glass, but her tone was soothing, reassuring. Several people had stopped to watch, but none approached to help. A jogger paused, shook his head, and continued running. A woman walking her own dog pulled her pet to the other side of the street and hurried past. Someone took a photo with their phone before walking away. Thomas felt his jaw clench at the casual cruelty of their indifference. The little girl seemed unbothered by the lack of help from adults. She pulled something from her pocket, crumpled bills that she smoothed out carefully before placing them in the jar. Even from the second floor, Thomas could see the handwritten label, Vet Help, in crooked child's handwriting, decorated with small drawings of hearts and paw prints. She had maybe $5 total. 5 wrinkled singles that probably represented her entire life savings. And she was giving all of it away for an animal she'd never seen before, with the absolute faith that someone somewhere would notice and care enough to help. Thomas stood frozen at his window, coffee long forgotten, watching this child demonstrate more compassion in 5 minutes than he'd allowed himself to feel in 5 years. The dog was hurt badly enough to need professional attention. That much was clear, even from a distance. The little girl's $5 wouldn't cover a basic examination, let alone whatever treatment would be required. He should call animal control. That was the sensible thing. The safe thing, the thing that wouldn't require him to get involved or care or risk having his carefully constructed walls of indifference challenged by a child's innocent belief in human goodness. Instead, Thomas Langley surprised himself by heading for the stairs. The bell above his shop door chimed as Thomas stepped onto Maple Street for the first time in weeks. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn, carrying the scent of leaves beginning their slow turn toward gold. He'd forgotten how different the world felt when you were actually in it, rather than observing from behind glass. The little girl looked up as his shadow fell across her and the injured dog. Her eyes were the deep brown of rich earth, framed by lashes that were damp with unshed tears. Despite her obvious distress, she straightened her small shoulders and lifted her chin with a dignity that reminded Thomas of soldiers he'd known. People who'd learned early that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but moving forward despite it. "He's hurt pretty bad," she said, her voice steady but small. "I think his leg might be broken. I put some of Grandma's bandages on the bleeding part, but I don't think I did it right." She gestured toward the makeshift first aid she'd applied, strips of cloth that had clearly been torn from something larger, wrapped with the careful attention of someone who'd watched medical procedures before. Thomas knelt beside her, his old knees protesting as they touched the pavement. The dog was indeed a golden retriever, probably 4 or 5 years old, with the kind of gentle expression that suggested he'd been someone's beloved companion. The animal's breathing was shallow but steady, and while there was blood on his left leg, Thomas's trained eye could see it wasn't immediately life-threatening. "You did good, sweetheart," Thomas heard himself say, the endearment slipping out before he could stop it. "Real good. What's your name?" "Emma," she replied, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "Emma Rodriguez. This is my street. I live with my grandma in the yellow house." She pointed toward a small cottage 2 blocks down, its cheerful paint jobs standing out among the more subdued homes around it. "I'm Thomas," he said, gently examining the dog's injuries. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking for broken bones and internal damage. "I used to work at the hospital helping hurt people. This little guy's going to need a veterinarian, and though that's a doctor for animals." Emma's face crumpled slightly. "I know what a vet is. I only have $5. She gestured toward the jar, where her crumpled bills sat like an offering to the gods of canine medicine. "Grandma says vets cost a lot of money, and we don't have a lot, but I couldn't just leave him here to hurt." The dog whimpered softly and tried to lift his head. Emma immediately leaned down and began stroking his ears with infinite gentleness. "It's okay, boy. We're going to help you. Someone's going to help you." She looked up at Thomas with eyes full of desperate hope. "Right? Someone will help him?" Thomas felt something crack inside his chest, a hairline fracture in the walls he'd spent 5 years building. This child, this stranger, was looking at him like he might be the answer to prayers he didn't even know he remembered how to pray. She was asking him to care about something beyond his own carefully managed pain. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he found himself nodding. "Yes," he said quietly, "someone's going to help him. The animal hospital is on Riverside Drive," Emma said, suddenly animated. "Dr. Chen works there. She's really nice. She helped Mrs. Patterson's cat when it got sick last winter. But I don't have a car, and I don't think the bus lets dogs on, especially hurt ones." Thomas glanced around at the small crowd that had gathered. Still, no one offered to help, just curious onlookers keeping their distance, as if compassion might be contagious. The jogger had returned from his run and was stretching against a nearby tree, pointedly not making eye contact. A woman with a baby stroller had stopped to watch, but made no move to approach. "I have a car," Thomas said, the words coming out before he'd fully decided to say them. "It's parked behind the bookstore." Emma's face lit up like sunrise. "Really? You'd really drive us to the vet?" "Us? Well, I can't just leave him with strangers," Emma said matter-of-factly. "He doesn't know you yet. He might be scared." Thomas almost smiled at that logic. The child was worried about the emotional welfare of an injured stray dog, concerned about his feelings while he was bleeding on the pavement. It was the kind of pure empathy that adults usually train themselves out of, but that children wielded like a superpower. "Of course," Thomas said. "We'll all go together." It took some careful maneuvering to get the dog into Thomas's old sedan without causing more injury. The animal seemed to understand they were trying to help and didn't struggle, though he whined softly when they lifted him. Emma climbed into the back seat and immediately began talking to the dog in soothing tones, her small hand resting gently on his head. "It's okay, sweetie. We're going to see Dr. Chen, and she's going to make you all better. You're such a good boy, such a brave boy." The dog's tail gave a weak wag at her praise. The drive to Riverside Drive took 12 minutes. 12 minutes, during which Thomas found himself stealing glances in the rearview mirror at the little girl who'd somehow convinced him to abandon his hermit existence for an injured animal he'd never seen before. Emma kept up a constant stream of gentle chatter directed at the dog, telling him about her grandmother's garden and the stray cat she fed behind their house, and how Dr. Chen had the kindest eyes of anyone she'd ever met. "How do you know so?" "Much about Dr. Chen?" Thomas asked. "She comes to our church sometimes," Emma replied without looking up from the dog. "She tells us about taking care of animals and being responsible pet owners. She said that animals are gifts, and gifts are supposed to be treasured." Thomas pulled into the parking lot of Riverside Animal Hospital, a modest brick building with cheerful yellow trim and large windows that let in plenty of natural light. Through the glass, he could see the waiting room was busy. Several people, with various pets, a bulletin board covered with photos of happy animals, and behind the reception desk, a young woman with kind eyes and gentle hands. Emma was out of the car almost before Thomas had put it in park, but she waited patiently while he came around to help lift the dog. Together they carried their patient toward the entrance, Emma's, small hands supporting the animal's head while Thomas handled the heavier end. "Don't worry," Emma whispered to the dog as they approached the door. "Dr. Chen is going to take really good care of you, and I'll stay with you the whole time, okay? I promise." Thomas felt that crack in his chest widen slightly. When was the last time he'd made a promise to another living creature? When was the last time he'd cared enough about anything to make guarantees about the future? The automatic doors opened with a soft whoosh, and they stepped into the warmth of the animal hospital. The receptionist looked up with professional concern, then broke into a genuine smile when she saw Emma. "Emma, what brings you here today, sweetheart?" "We found a hurt dog," Emma said, her voice taking on the serious tone of someone delivering important news. "He got hit by a car, and his leg is bleeding. We brought him to see Dr. Chen." The receptionist, her name tag read Maria, immediately came around the counter. "Let's get him right into an examination room. Dr. Chen is with another patient, but she'll want to see this little guy as soon as possible." As they followed Maria down a short hallway lined with photos of recovered animals, Thomas caught sight of Emma's reflection in the glass door of one of the treatment rooms. Her face was set with determination, her jaw clenched with the kind of resolve he'd seen in combat medics and emergency room nurses, people who decided that giving up simply wasn't an option. For the first time in 5 years, Thomas found himself genuinely curious about what would happen next. Dr. Sarah Chen appeared in the examination room doorway within minutes, her stethoscope draped around her neck like a badge of healing authority. She was younger than Thomas had expected, maybe 40, with intelligent dark eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of calm confidence that immediately put both humans and animals at ease. "Emma, honey, what have we got here?" Dr. Chen's voice carried the gentle authority of someone accustomed to dealing with frightened creatures of all species. "A golden retriever," Emma said, unconsciously mimicking the clinical tone she'd heard adults use. "Hit by a car about an hour ago. The driver didn't stop. His left back leg is hurt, and there was bleeding. But I put bandages on it like Grandma, and taught me. Dr. Chen knelt beside the examination table where they'd carefully positioned the dog, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she began her assessment. The animal lifted his head to look at her, tail giving a tentative wag, despite his obvious discomfort. "You did excellent first aid, Emma," Dr. Chen said, examining the makeshift bandages. "These bandages probably kept him from losing too much blood. You may have saved his life." Emma beamed with pride, then immediately looked worried again. "Is he going to be okay? Really okay, I mean?" Thomas found himself holding his breath as Dr. Chen continued her examination. When had he started caring about the answer? When had this stranger's dog become something more than a problem to be solved and forgotten? "Well," Dr. Chen said thoughtfully, "the good news is that there don't appear to be any internal injuries, and the leg isn't broken. The bad news is that he's got some deep lacerations that are going to need cleaning and stitching, and I want to keep him here for observation to make sure there aren't any complications." "How much will that cost?" Emma asked, her voice small but determined. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her crumpled $5 bills. "I have this much. Is it enough?" Dr. Chen's expression softened as she looked at the money in Emma's small hand. Thomas saw something pass over her face, the same crack in professional composure that he'd felt when he first saw Emma kneeling in the street with the injured dog. "Emma, sweetheart, medical care for animals can be expensive." "I'll cover it," Thomas interrupted, surprising himself again. Both Emma and Dr. Chen turned to look at him with identical expressions of surprise. "Sir, that's very generous, but the bill could be several $100s, Dr. Chen said carefully. "Cleaning and suturing the wounds, pain medication, overnight observation." "I said I'll cover it." Thomas's voice came out gruffer than he'd intended, more to hide his own confusion about his decision than from any irritation. "Whatever it takes." Emma stared at him with wide eyes. "Really? You'd really pay for all of it?" Thomas nodded, not trusting his voice. What was he doing? He'd spent 5 years avoiding exactly this kind of emotional entanglement, this investment in outcomes he couldn't control. Yet here he was, writing a blank check for the medical care of a stray dog, because a 6-year-old girl had looked at him with hope in her eyes. "That's incredibly kind of you, Mr. Dr. Chen paused, waiting for his name. "Langley. Thomas Langley." "Mr. Langley, I'm Dr. Chen, and I promise we'll take excellent care of your friend here." She scratched behind the dog's ears, earning another weak tail wag. "Has he got a name?" Emma looked at Thomas, then back at the dog. "I've been calling him Boy, but that's not a real name. What should we name him?" "He's not—" Thomas started to say that the dog wasn't theirs to name, that this was temporary, that they'd find his owners or surrender him to a shelter once he was healed. But Emma was looking at him with such earnest expectation that the words died in his throat. "What about Rusty?" Emma suggested. "His fur is kind of golden rusty colored, don't you think?" Thomas looked at the dog's coat, which, despite the blood and dirt, did indeed have a rich reddish gold hue that caught the examination room's fluorescent lights. "Rusty seems like a good name." "Rusty it is," Dr. Chen said, making a note on her clipboard. "Now, Rusty, let's see about getting you fixed up properly." The next hour passed in a blur of medical terminology and gentle efficiency. Dr. Chen explained each step of the treatment process while she worked, partly for Emma's benefit and partly, Thomas suspected, to keep them all focused on the positive aspects of the situation. The wounds were cleaned and sutured with meticulous care. Pain medication was administered. Rusty bore it all with the patient dignity of an animal who understood that these humans were trying to help him. Emma never left the dog's side, maintaining a steady stream of encouraging chatter throughout the procedure. "You're being so brave. Rusty, Dr. Chen is almost done. You're such a good boy, such a strong boy." Thomas found himself watching Emma as much as the medical procedure. There was something about her unwavering focus, her absolute commitment to this animal she'd known for less than 2 hours, that stirred memories he'd thought he'd successfully buried. He'd seen that same fierce protectiveness in combat medics, in nurses working trauma units, in Margaret, during her volunteer work at the Children's Hospital. He's going to need to stay overnight for observation, Dr. Chen explained as she finished the last of the sutures. I want to make sure there's no infection developing, and he should be on IV fluids for the next few hours to help with any shock from the accident. Emma's face fell. Can I stay with him? I promised I wouldn't leave him alone. Oh, sweetheart, we don't usually allow visitors overnight. She can visit during regular hours, Thomas found himself saying. I'll bring her by in the morning to check on him. Emma turned to him with such gratitude that Thomas felt his chest tighten. You will? Really? Really? Dr. Chen looked between them with an expression that suggested she was seeing something that pleased her. That sounds like a perfect plan. Rusty will be in good hands here tonight, Emma. I promise. As they prepared to leave, Emma insisted on saying a proper goodbye to Rusty, leaning down to whisper something in his ear that made his tail wag weakly. Thomas hung back, watching this display of pure, uncomplicated love with something that might have been envy. Mr. Langley, Dr. Chen's voice drew him aside while Emma was focused on Rusty. What you're doing for that little girl, it's special. She clearly cares about you a great deal. She doesn't even know me, Thomas protested. Dr. Chen smiled. Sometimes that's when caring matters most, when it's not based on obligation or history, just on recognizing something good in another person. As they walked back to the car, Emma slipped her small hand into Thomas's weathered one without asking permission. Her palm was warm and slightly sticky in the way of children's hands, and Thomas found himself gripping it more tightly than necessary. Thank you, she said quietly. Thank you for helping Rusty. You're welcome, Thomas replied, and was surprised to discover he meant it completely. The yellow house at the end of Maple Street looked like something from a children's storybook. Cheerful daffodil-colored siding, white shutters, and a front porch crowded with potted plants in various stages of autumn bloom. Wind chimes, made from recycled glass bottles, hung from the porch ceiling, creating gentle music in the afternoon breeze. Thomas had intended to simply drop Emma off and retreat to the safety of his bookstore, but as they pulled into the driveway, the front door opened and a woman emerged who commanded attention simply by existing. Emma's grandmother was somewhere in her 60s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun, and the kind of weathered hands that spoke of decades spent in honest work. She wore a flower-dusted apron over a simple dress, and her dark eyes, so, like Emma's, held both warmth and a wariness that suggested she was accustomed to protecting what mattered most to her. Emma Rodriguez, where have you been? She called, but her voice carried relief rather than anger. Mrs. Patterson called and said she saw you running towards some kind of commotion on the street. Grandma, we saved a dog. Emma burst from the car with the enthusiasm of someone bursting with news too important to contain. His name is Rusty, and he got hit by a car. But Mr. Thomas helped me take him to Dr. Chen, and she fixed him up, and he's going to be okay. The woman, Clara, Thomas remembered Emma mentioning, looked from her granddaughter to the strange man still sitting in his car, her expression shifting from relief to cautious curiosity. Thomas felt himself being evaluated with the thoroughness of someone who'd learned to be careful about the strangers who entered their lives. Emma, sweetheart, why don't you go inside and wash your hands? Clara said gently. They're covered in, is that blood? Just a little bit. Rusty was bleeding when we found him, but I put bandages on it like you taught me, and then Mr. Thomas paid for the veterinarian to make him all better. Emma's words tumbled over each other in her eagerness to share the day's adventure. Clara's gaze sharpened as it focused on Thomas. You paid for veterinary care? Thomas felt like a suspect being questioned by someone with considerable experience in getting to the truth. He climbed out of his car slowly, unsure of the protocol for this situation. When was the last time he'd been introduced to someone new? When was the last time he'd needed to explain his actions to a protective grandmother? The dog needed medical attention, he said simply. Emma found him after he was hit by a car, and you just happened to be there. I own the bookstore on Maple Street. I saw what happened from my window." Clara studied him for a long moment, taking in his rumpled appearance, his obvious discomfort with the social interaction, the way Emma was looking at him like he'd personally hung the moon. Something in her expression softened slightly. "Emma, go inside and get cleaned up," she repeated. "I want to talk to Mr. Langley, Thomas Langley. Mr. Langley, please." She gestured toward the porch chairs. Emma looked between them with the sharp instincts of a child who recognized adult conversation that didn't include her. "You're not going to be mean to Mr. Thomas, are you, Grandma? He's a hero. He saved Rusty." "I'm not going to be mean to anyone, Mija. Go wash your hands." Emma disappeared into the house, but Thomas caught a glimpse of her face pressed against the window, clearly intending to monitor the situation from inside. Clara settled into one of the porch chairs with the grace of someone who'd spent many evenings in this same spot, watching the world go by. Thomas remained standing, uncertain whether he was being invited to stay or politely asked to explain himself before leaving. "Sit," Clara said, not unkindly. "You look like you're expecting me to bite." Thomas lowered himself into the other chair, which creaked slightly under his weight. The porch offered a perfect view of the street where this morning's drama had unfolded. He could actually see his bookstore from here, 2 blocks away. "Emma's a special child," Clara began, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone choosing words with precision. "She has a tendency to see the best in people, sometimes before they see it in themselves. That's a beautiful quality, but it's also one that can put her in vulnerable positions." Thomas nodded, unsure what response was expected. "Her parents died in a car accident 3 years ago," Clara continued, and Thomas felt his chest tighten at the matter-of-fact way she delivered this information. "Emma was in the car, but survived with only minor injuries. Since then, she's lived with me and we take care of each other." The weight of that statement settled between them. Thomas found himself looking at the house with new eyes. The careful maintenance despite clearly limited resources, the small garden that provided vegetables as well as beauty, the general air of making do with what you had and being grateful for it. "I'm not wealthy, Mr. Langley," Clara said quietly. "I'm a seamstress, and I take in alterations and mending to make ends meet. Emma knows we live on a budget, which is why what you did today, paying for that dog's medical care, means more than you probably realize." "It wasn't," Thomas started to say it wasn't a big deal, but Clara held up a hand. "Let me finish. Emma has been through more than any child should have to experience. She's learned to be careful with hope, to understand that sometimes good and things don't last. But today she saw something that reminded her that there are still people in the world who do good things simply because they're the right things to do." Thomas felt heat rise in his face. "I'm not some kind of saint, Mrs. Rodriguez, Clara Rodriguez, and I'm not saying you're a saint. I'm saying you did something kind for my granddaughter when you didn't have to, and I want to thank you for that." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the wind chimes providing gentle accompaniment to the sounds of the neighborhood settling into evening. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. A car door slammed. Children's voices carried from a backyard several houses away. "The veterinary bill," Clara said eventually. "How much was it?" "It doesn't matter. It matters to me. I don't accept charity, Mr. Langley." Thomas looked at her carefully, recognizing the pride in her voice, not the stubborn kind that caused harm, but the dignified kind that came from a lifetime of standing on your own 2 feet. "It wasn't charity. It was—" He stopped, unsure how to explain what it had been. "It was what?" Clara prompted gently. "I don't know," Thomas admitted. "I saw Emma with that dog, and she reminded me of someone I used to know. Someone who believed in helping others, even when it cost more than you could easily afford." Clara's expression shifted again, this time towards something that might have been understanding. "Your wife?" Thomas nodded, surprised that his throat had tightened around the simple acknowledgement. "How long has she been gone?" 5 years. "And you've been living above that bookstore all by yourself since then?" It wasn't a question, and Thomas didn't treat it as one. Emma mentioned that you seemed sad when you first saw the dog, Clara said. She has good instincts about people's feelings, too good sometimes. The front door opened and Emma appeared, hands clearly scrubbed clean and hair smoothed back into neater pigtails. "Are you two done talking about me?" she asked with the directness of childhood. "We weren't talking about you," Clara said, though her slight smile suggested otherwise. "Yes, you were. I could tell." Emma settled on the porch steps, positioning herself where she could see both adults. "Mr. Thomas, are you coming with us to see Rusty tomorrow? I said I would bring you to visit him. But are you going to visit him too, or just drop me off and leave?" Thomas found himself caught between Emma's expectant gaze and Clara's watchful one. The honest answer was that he'd planned to drop her off and escape back to his comfortable isolation. But looking at Emma's hopeful face, he found that plan harder to defend. "I'll visit him too," he heard himself say. Emma's smile could have powered the neighborhood. "Good. Rusty will want to see you. Dogs remember people who help them." As Thomas drove home later, Clara's parting words echoed in his mind. "Emma's bedtime is 8 o'clock, but she'll probably be up early tomorrow asking about Rusty. We'll be ready whenever you want to go to the hospital." For the first time in years, Thomas found himself looking forward to tomorrow. The next 3 weeks fell into a rhythm that surprised Thomas with its comfortable predictability. Every morning at 8 sharp, Emma would appear at his bookstore door, usually with a paper bag containing something Clara had baked, muffins, cookies, occasionally a slice of pie that made Thomas remember what home cooking tasted like. They would drive to the animal hospital together, spend an hour with Rusty as he recovered, then return to the bookstore where Emma had somehow become his unofficial assistant. The transformation in both the dog and the shop was remarkable. Rusty had healed quickly under Dr. Chen's care, his natural golden retriever temperament shining through as the pain subsided. He greeted Emma each morning with enthusiastic tail wagging and gentle kisses, and had begun acknowledging Thomas with what could only be described as dignified appreciation. The dog seemed to understand that Thomas was the reason for the medical care and comfortable recovery kennel, but Emma was the reason for the love and attention that made healing bearable. The bookstore, meanwhile, had come alive in ways Thomas hadn't expected. Emma had an insatiable curiosity about everything on the shelves, asking endless questions about stories and authors and why people wrote books in the first place. She'd discovered the children's section that Margaret had so carefully curated and had begun reading to herself in the small chairs while Thomas worked. Her presence had attracted other children, friends from school who stopped by to see what Emma was doing, parents who lingered longer when they realized the gruff old bookstore owner was actually quite good with kids. "Mr. Thomas, why do you have so many sad books?" Emma asked one afternoon, perched on the step stool behind the counter while Thomas updated inventory. She'd been sorting through a box of recent acquisitions, examining each cover with serious consideration. "What makes you think they're sad books?" "Well, this one's about a war, and this one's about someone dying, and this one has a lady crying on the cover." She held up the books as evidence. "Don't you have any happy books?" Thomas looked around his shop with fresh eyes. When had he started favoring literature that reflected his own emotional state? When had joy become something he avoided rather than sought? "There are happy books," he said, gesturing toward the children's section. "You've been reading them. But what about happy? Books for grown-ups. Grandma likes stories where people fall in love and everything works out okay. She says life is hard enough without reading about more sadness." That evening, Thomas found himself standing in front of Clara's yellow house with a paper bag containing 3 romance novels he'd ordered special, feeling foolish and strangely hopeful. When Clara opened the door, her surprise quickly shifted to delight. "You brought me books? Emma said you like stories with happy endings." Clara's smile transformed her whole face. "Come in, please. I was just finishing dinner. Have you eaten?" The Inside of Clara's house was as warm and welcoming as its exterior suggested. The living room was small but comfortable, filled with handmade touches that spoke of creativity born from necessity. Quilts draped over furniture that had seen better decades but remained sturdy and loved. Family photographs covered every available surface, and the scent of something delicious drifted from the kitchen. "Emma's at her friend Lucy's house for a sleepover," Clara explained, noticing Thomas glance around as if looking for the little girl. "First time I've had an evening to myself." "In months," Thomas immediately felt like an intruder. "I should go." "You should stay and let me thank you properly for these books." Clara held up the bag. "And for everything else you've done for us these past few weeks." Over dinner, pot roast with vegetables from Clara's garden, Thomas found himself talking more than he had in years. Clara had the gift of asking questions that opened doors rather than closing them, and somehow he found himself sharing stories about Margaret, about the bookstore, about his years counseling veterans who were struggling to find their place in a world that no longer made sense to them. "Is that why you understand Emma so well?" Clara asked as they cleared the dishes. "Because you know what it's like to feel lost?" Thomas considered the question while drying a plate with methodical care. "Maybe. Emma's not lost, though. She knows exactly who she is and what she believes in. She believes in you. I don't know." "Why?" Clara was quiet for a moment, arranging the clean dishes in her cupboard with the same careful attention Thomas gave to organizing his books. "Emma's parents were wonderful people," she said eventually. "David was my son, Emma's father. He had the same generous heart she does. After the accident, Emma stopped trusting new people for a long time. She was polite but distant, like she was protecting herself from caring too much." Thomas felt his chest tighten. "What changed?" "You did. The morning she found Rusty, she came home talking about the sad man in the bookstore who helped save a dog, even though he didn't have to. She said you looked like someone who needed a friend." That night, as Thomas walked back to his apartment above the bookstore, he carried with him not just the memory of Clara's apple pie, the best he'd ever tasted, but also a sense of belonging that had been absent from his life for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like. The next morning brought Emma back to the bookstore with renewed energy and a detailed report about her sleepover. "Lucy's mom said she might bring Lucy here to look at books," Emma announced, settling into her usual spot behind the counter. "I told her you're not scary once people get to know you. Thanks for that recommendation. It's true, though, you just look scary because you're sad. But Grandma says sadness doesn't last forever if you let people help carry it." Thomas paused in his sorting of returned books. "Your grandmother is a wise woman. She likes you, you know. She was humming this morning, and she only hums when she's happy about something." That afternoon, Mrs. Henderson from next door stopped by the shop, the first time she'd set foot inside in years. She claimed to be looking for a cookbook, but Thomas suspected she was really investigating the changes she'd noticed in both him and his establishment. "That little girl has been good for you," Mrs. Henderson observed, watching Emma organize the children's section with intense concentration. "You look less," she paused, searching for diplomatic phrasing, "less like a bear with a thorn in his paw." Mrs. Henderson laughed, the first genuine expression of warmth Thomas had seen from her. "I was going to say less lonely, but your version works too." As the days passed, Thomas began to notice other changes. He found himself choosing books with happier themes for the front window display. He ordered children's books more frequently, watching Emma's face light up when new titles arrived. He started keeping a jar of dog treats behind the counter for the pets that accompanied their humans into the shop. Most surprisingly, he began looking forward to the parts of his day that involved other people. Emma's morning arrivals, Clara's occasional visits to the shop, Dr. Chen's updates about Rusty's progress, even Mrs. Henderson's increasingly friendly greetings when they passed on the street. It was Clara who brought up the subject that had been hovering unspoken between all of them. "Rusty's completely healed," she said one evening as they sat on her front porch watching Emma play in the yard with the dog, who was visiting for a few hours under Dr. Chen's supervision. Dr. Chen says he can be released permanently any time. Now, Thomas nodded, though something heavy settled in his stomach. That's good news. The question is, what happens next? Emma and Rusty were engaged in a game of gentle tug-of-war with a rope toy, both of them clearly delighted with each other's company. The dog's tail never stopped wagging when Emma was around, and the little girl's laughter had become a sound. Thomas looked forward to hearing. Emma's going to want to keep him, Thomas said. Emma wants a lot of things that aren't practical. A dog is a big responsibility, and I work long hours. Plus, there's the cost of food, veterinary care, licenses. Clara sighed. I can't give her everything she wants, much as I'd like to. Thomas watched Emma scratch behind Rusty's ears, the dog's expression one of pure contentment. What if the cost wasn't an issue? Clara turned to look at him sharply. Thomas, I told you I don't accept charity. It wouldn't be charity. It would be, he struggled to find the right words, a partnership. Rusty could live here with you and Emma, but I could help with expenses. And maybe he could visit the bookstore during the day, keep Emma and me company. Why would you want to do that? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, watching the girl and the dog, who had somehow become essential to his daily happiness. Because 5 weeks ago, I was just existing. Now I'm living again, and I think that's worth something. Rusty came home to the yellow house on a Tuesday that felt like Christmas morning. Emma had been awake since dawn, checking the clock every few minutes and asking if it was time to pick him up yet. When they finally arrived at the animal hospital, Dr. Chen had discharge papers ready and a small bag of the special food Rusty had been eating during his recovery. He's all yours, she said, scratching behind the dog's ears one last time, though I suspect he's been yours since the day Emma found him. The ride home was filled with Emma's chatter directed at Rusty, who sat in the back seat with his head out the window, tongue lolling happily in the breeze. Thomas caught glimpses of them in the rearview mirror, the little girl with her arm around the golden dog, both of them looking like they'd found exactly where they belonged. Clara had spent the morning preparing for their new family member. A dog bed appeared in Emma's room, along with food and water bowls in the kitchen, and a collection of toys that must have cost more than Clara usually spent on herself in a month. When Thomas raised an eyebrow at the expense, she waved off his concern with the dignity he'd come to expect from her. A girl's first dog deserves proper supplies. The transition was remarkably smooth. Rusty seemed to understand that this was his new home, exploring each room with polite curiosity before settling on the living room rug as if he'd been there for years. Emma shadowed his every move, providing running commentary on the house rules and family routines. This is where we eat breakfast, and this is Grandma's sewing room, where you have to be very quiet, and this is my bedroom, where you can sleep if you want to. Thomas found himself staying for dinner more nights than not, drawn by the warmth of their small family and the way Rusty had completed something none of them had realized was missing. The dog had appointed himself Emma's guardian, following her everywhere with the devoted attention of a creature who understood he'd been saved and wanted to return the favor. It was during one of these dinner conversations that Emma made a discovery that changed everything. Mr. Thomas, why do you have a picture of soldiers in your wallet? Emma asked, having somehow managed to glimpse the worn photograph when Thomas paid for groceries they'd stopped to pick up on the way home. Thomas froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. The photograph was one he'd carried for 40 years. A group shot of his medical unit in Vietnam, taken a week before half the men in it would be dead or wounded, beyond recognition. Emma, that's private, Clara said gently, but Thomas could see the curiosity in her eyes as well. It's okay, Thomas said, though his voice sounded strange even to himself. He pulled out his wallet and extracted the creased photograph, handling it with the reverence reserved for sacred objects. These were friends of mine. We served together in the war. Emma studied the photograph with serious attention. You look young and scared. I was both. Were you a soldier? I was a medic, a doctor for soldiers who got hurt. Emma looked up at him with new understanding. Is that how you knew Rusty was hurt but not too hurt? Because you used to help hurt people? Thomas nodded, surprised by the child's ability to make connections that adults often missed. Did some of your soldier friends die? Emma's question was asked with the matter-of-fact directness of childhood, but Thomas felt it hit him like a physical blow. Yes, he said quietly. Some of them died. Emma was quiet for a moment, studying his face with the intensity she usually reserved for injured animals. Is that why you're sad? Because you miss them? Thomas looked at Clara, who was watching the conversation with careful attention. He'd never talked about the war with Margaret, had barely acknowledged it even to himself. But something about Emma's innocent curiosity made the old walls seem less necessary. Partly, he said. When people you care about die, especially when you couldn't save them, it makes you afraid to care about new people. But you care about us now, Emma pointed out with unassailable 6-year-old logic. Yes, I do. And we're not dead. No, you're not. Emma nodded as if this settled an important matter. Grandma says that being afraid of being sad is what makes people lonely. She says it's better to be sad sometimes than to be lonely all the time. That night, as Thomas walked Rusty around the block before bedtime, a routine that had somehow become his responsibility, he found himself thinking about Emma's words. The dog trotted beside him with easy companionship, occasionally pausing to investigate interesting smells or acknowledge other dogs with dignified tail wags. You're a good dog, Rusty, Thomas said aloud, feeling only slightly foolish for talking to an animal. Emma saved your life, you know, but I think maybe you saved hers too. The next few weeks brought a deepening of the routines that had become precious to all of them. Emma and Rusty spent their mornings at the bookstore where the dog had claimed a spot near the window where he could watch the street while Emma helped Thomas with simple tasks. Customers had begun commenting on the friendlier atmosphere, and several had mentioned bringing their children in specifically because they'd heard the bookstore owner was good with kids now. Clara's evening visits to the shop had become regular occurrences, usually timed to coincide with Emma's need to be collected for dinner. But she often lingered, discussing books or sharing stories about her sewing customers, or simply sitting in comfortable silence while Emma read to Rusty from the picture book she'd begun to master. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Clara discovered Thomas's hidden weakness. Emma had fallen asleep in one of the small chairs, exhausted from a day of helping reorganize the mystery section, with Rusty curled at her feet like a furry guardian. Clara had covered the child with her sweater and was preparing to wake her gently when she noticed Thomas reaching for something behind the counter with shaking hands. The small flask was silver and tarnished, clearly old and clearly important to him. Thomas unscrewed the cap and took a quick drink, then seemed to realize Clara was watching. It's not what you think, he said quickly, capping the flask and putting it away. I don't drink much, just sometimes when the dreams get bad. Clara's expression remained carefully neutral. What kind of dreams? Thomas was quiet for so long that Clara thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. The war. People I couldn't save. Margaret at the end, when the pain was so bad and there was nothing I could do to help her. He looked at Emma, sleeping peacefully in the chair. I've been having them less since Emma and Rusty came along, but sometimes the old pain comes back and you need something to make it bearable, Clara finished gently. Thomas nodded. Ashamed. My husband drank, Clara said quietly. Not because of war, but because he lost his job and couldn't find another one and felt like a failure as a provider. I know the difference between someone who drinks to escape responsibility and someone who drinks to survive unbearable memories. You should probably talk to someone about those dreams. But until you're ready to do that, you should probably not drink alone. Clara's voice was firm, but kind. Emma needs you healthy, Thomas. We both do. The admission hung in the air between them. Acknowledged, but not yet fully explored. Thomas looked at this woman who'd somehow become essential to his happiness, who'd shared her granddaughter and her home and her wisdom without asking for anything in return except honesty. "I haven't talked to anyone about the war in 40 years, he said. "Maybe it's time." Emma stirred in her chair, mumbling something in her sleep about Rusty needing his medicine. The dog's tail thumped once against the floor, as if he were dreaming. "Two. She's changed everything," Thomas said, looking at the sleeping child. "She has a gift for that. Her parents were the same way. They made everyone around them want to be better than they were. I'm trying to be worthy of her faith in me." Clara reached across the space between their chairs and squeezed his hand gently. "You already are, Thomas. You just need to start believing it yourself." The discovery came on a Saturday morning when Emma was helping Thomas organize a box of old newspapers he'd been meaning to recycle. She developed a fascination with reading headlines from decades past, asking questions about events she'd never heard of and people who'd shaped the world before she was born. "Mr. Thomas, look at this dog," Emma said, holding up a newspaper. "From 6 months earlier. He looks just like Rusty." Thomas glanced over from where he was pricing a collection of vintage books, then looked more carefully. The photograph showed a golden retriever sitting beside an elderly couple on what appeared to be their front porch. The headline read, "Beloved pet missing after medical emergency. Family asks for community's help." Thomas felt his stomach drop as he read the article. Harold and Esther Morrison, both in their 70s, had lost their golden retriever during the chaos of a medical emergency that had sent Mrs. Morrison to the hospital for emergency surgery. In the confusion of ambulances and paramedics, their dog had apparently bolted from the house and disappeared into the neighborhood. The article included several photographs of the missing pet, and Thomas couldn't deny what Emma had seen immediately. The dog in the pictures was unmistakably Rusty. "It does look like him," Thomas said carefully, his mind racing through the implications. "Dogs can look very similar, though." Emma studied the photograph with the intensity she brought to everything important. "No, look at his ear. See how it has that little white patch, and the way his tail curls? That's Rusty, that's definitely Rusty." Thomas looked at the photographs again, his heart sinking as he recognized detail after detail that confirmed Emma's observation. The white patch on the left ear that he'd noticed during those first visits to Dr. Chen. The distinctive curl of the tail. Even the dog's expression was identical, gentle, intelligent, patient. "Emma, even if it is the same dog, this article is from 6 months ago. They probably stopped looking by now." But even as he said it, Thomas knew it wasn't true. He'd seen the love in that elderly couple's faces in the photograph, the same desperate hope he'd seen in Clara's eyes when Emma was hurt or worried. People didn't stop looking for family members, even the four-legged ones. Emma had gone quiet, staring at the newspaper with the serious expression she wore when working through complex problems. "Mr. Thomas, if Rusty belongs to these people, and they're sad because they miss him, don't we have to tell them we found him?" Thomas felt the question hit him like a physical blow. Of course, they had to tell the Morrisons they'd found their dog. Of course, Emma, with her pure moral compass, would immediately understand what the right thing to do was. But knowing what was right and being able to bear the consequences were two entirely different things. "We should probably research this. More before we do anything," Thomas said, hating himself for the cowardice in his voice. "Research what? If it's their dog, they miss him. And if they miss him, we should give him back." Emma's logic was flawless and heartbreaking. That evening, after Emma and Clara had gone home and Rusty was settled in his bed at the yellow house, Thomas sat in his apartment staring at the newspaper article. He'd found the original online and discovered that the Morrison family had continued placing missing dog notices in the local paper for months. The most recent one had run just 2 weeks ago. Thomas understood exactly what returning Rusty would mean. Emma would be devastated. The dog had become her constant companion. The friend who'd helped her heal from losses, Thomas was only beginning to understand. Clara would support whatever decision they made, but he'd seen how much joy Rusty brought to their small family. And selfishly, Thomas knew that losing Rusty would mean losing a piece of the happiness he'd found in their makeshift family. But he also knew what it meant to lose someone you loved and spend every day wondering what had happened to them, whether they were safe, whether they were coming home. He'd lived with that uncertainty for 5 years about Margaret, even though he'd known exactly where she was and what was happening to her. The not knowing, the helplessness, was its own special kind of torture. The next morning, Emma arrived at the bookstore with Rusty and immediately sensed something was wrong. "You've been thinking about the newspaper," she said, settling into her usual spot behind the counter while Rusty took his place by the window. "Yes. And you think we should find those people and tell them we have their dog?" Thomas looked at this remarkable child who understood moral complexity better than most adults. "What do you think we should do?" Emma was quiet for a long time, absently stroking Rusty's head while she worked through the problem. The dog seemed to sense the seriousness of the conversation, staying unusually still and alert. "I think," Emma said slowly, "that if I lost Rusty and someone found him, I'd want them to tell me, even if it took a long time, because not knowing where someone you love is might be worse than missing them." Thomas felt his throat tighten. "Even if it meant you had to give him back?" Emma's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "Even then, because keeping him would be like stealing, wouldn't it? You can't really love someone if you're not willing to do what's best for them." The wisdom of it hit Thomas like a revelation. Here was a 6-year-old child articulating something about love that he'd never fully understood. That real love meant being willing to sacrifice your own happiness for the welfare of those you cared about. It was a lesson he'd failed to learn in 40 years of adult relationships. "Would you like me to help you find their contact information?" Thomas asked gently. Emma nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "But can we visit them first, before we decide anything? I want to see if they really love him as much." As we do. That afternoon, Thomas found himself driving across town with Emma and Rusty in the back seat, following directions to an address he'd found in the phone book. The Morrison house was in an older neighborhood, with mature trees and the kind of careful landscaping that spoke of decades of attention from people who took pride in their home. As they pulled into the driveway, an elderly man emerged from the garage, moving slowly but with purpose. He was tall and thin, probably in his 70s, with silver hair and the careful movements of someone managing chronic pain. When he saw the car, his expression shifted to polite curiosity. Then Rusty barked. The change in Harold Morrison's face was instantaneous and transformative. He froze for a moment, as if afraid to believe what he was hearing, then moved toward the car with surprising speed. "Chester," he called, using what was apparently Rusty's real name. "Chester, is that really you?" Rusty began whining and pawing at the car window with an excitement Thomas had never seen from him before. The dog clearly recognized his original owner, and the reunion was affecting all of them. Emma was crying quietly in the back seat. Harold Morrison was openly weeping as he approached the car, and Thomas found his own eyes stinging with unexpected emotion. "Esther!" Harold called toward the house. "Esther, come quickly. Chester's come home." As Thomas helped Rusty out of the car and watched the joyful reunion between dog and owners, he realized that Emma had been right about everything. This was where Rusty belonged, with people who'd loved him first and longest, people whose grief at losing him was matched only by their overwhelming joy at having him returned, but understanding what was right didn't make it hurt any less. The drive back to Clara's house was the quietest ride Thomas could remember. Emma sat in the back seat, clutching a piece of paper that would change everything. A crayon drawing she'd made the night before, showing herself, Thomas, and Rusty standing together in front of the bookstore, all of them smiling under a bright yellow sun. She'd planned to give it to Thomas as a surprise, but now it seemed to represent everything they were about to lose. Harold and Esther Morrison had been everything Thomas had hoped they wouldn't be. Kind, gentle, obviously devoted to the dog they called Chester, and completely heartbroken by his disappearance 6 months earlier. Esther, recovering from the emergency surgery that had precipitated Chester's escape, had wept openly when she saw him again. Harold had explained how they'd searched everywhere, put up flyers, contacted every shelter and veterinarian in 3 counties. "We never stopped believing he'd come home," Esther had said, her weathered hands trembling as she stroked Chester's familiar head. "He's been our family for 8 years, since our daughter gave him to us as a puppy." Emma had listened to every word, with the serious attention she gave to important adult conversations, asking questions about Chester's favorite toys and foods, and whether he still liked to sleep on the big bed with them. The Morrisons' answers painted a picture of a beloved family member who'd been deeply missed, and Thomas could see Emma processing each detail, understanding more clearly with every passing moment just how much this reunion meant to the elderly couple. "Would you like to stay for dinner?" Esther had asked. "Chester always loved having visitors, and we'd love to hear about how you found him and took such good care of him." Emma had looked at Thomas with eyes that seemed far too old for her 6 years. "We should probably go home now," she'd said quietly, "but thank you for letting us visit." Now, as Thomas pulled into Clara's driveway, he dreaded the conversation that was waiting for them. Clara was on the front porch, as if she'd sensed that something important had happened. Her expression shifted from welcome to concern as she saw Emma's tear-streaked face and the defeated set of Thomas's shoulders. "What's wrong?" Clara asked, coming down the porch steps to meet them. "Rusty belongs to someone else," Emma said simply, climbing out of the car with the drawing clutched in her small hand. "His real name is Chester, and his family has been looking for him since he got lost. They love him very much." Clara's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, understanding, and finally a resigned sadness that told Thomas she'd been prepared for this possibility, even if she hadn't wanted to acknowledge it. "Are you sure?" she asked gently. Emma nodded, then looked at the drawing in her hands. "They showed us pictures of him as a puppy, and they knew exactly how he likes his ears scratched, and they called him by a different name, and he remembered them." She paused, struggling with the enormity of what they'd discovered. "They're old, Grandma, and they were so sad without him. Mrs. Morrison was crying because she missed him so much." Clara knelt down to Emma's level, her expression tender and proud at the same time. "And what do you think we should do about that, Mija?" "I think we should give him back," Emma said, her voice wavering but determined. "Even though it's going to hurt, because keeping him when he belongs to someone else would be like stealing, and we're not thieves." Thomas felt his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. Pride, maybe, or love, or simple amazement at this child's capacity for moral courage in the face of heartbreak. "That's a very grown-up decision, Emma," Clara said softly. "And it's the right decision, even though it's the hardest one." Emma nodded, tears starting fresh. "I know, but Grandma, what if they don't want to be our friends after we give Chester back? What if we never see him again?" Clara looked at Thomas, over Emma's head, and in that look was a question about how much hope they should allow themselves and their granddaughter. Thomas thought about Harold and Esther Morrison, about the gratitude in their voices and the kindness in their faces, and felt a small spark of possibility. "I think people who love the same dog probably have a lot in common," he said carefully, "and I think people who are grateful for kindness usually want to return it." That evening, after a dinner that none of them had much appetite for, Thomas found himself sitting on Clara's front porch while Emma played half-heartedly in the yard. The child's usual energy seemed dampened, and even her games lacked their normal enthusiasm. "She's handling this better than I expected," Clara said quietly, watching Emma toss a ball for an imaginary dog. "She's remarkable," Thomas agreed. "I don't think I would have been that generous at her age. I'm not sure I'd be that generous now." Clara was quiet for a moment, her fingers working automatically on a piece of mending in her lap, a habit Thomas had noticed she fell back on when she was thinking through complex emotions. "You know," she said eventually, "Emma's parents would be so proud of her. They raised her for 3 years to understand that doing the right thing isn't always the same as doing the easy thing." Thomas watched Emma, who had abandoned her game, and was now lying on her back in the grass, staring up at the evening sky with the contemplative stillness that seemed to be her natural response to big emotions. "What happens after we return Chester?" Thomas asked. "We adjust. We remember how lucky we were to have him for a while, and we go back to being a family of 3 instead of 4. And me? Do I go back to being the hermit bookstore owner?" Clara's hands stilled on her sewing. "Is that what you want?" Thomas considered the question seriously. A month ago, the answer would have been an automatic yes. Back to the safety of isolation, back to the predictable rhythms of solitude, back to a life that hurt less because it risked less. But now, looking at Emma sprawled in the grass and Clara beside him on the porch, he couldn't imagine voluntarily returning to that empty existence. "No," he said quietly, "I don't want to go back to that." "Then don't." It was that simple and that complicated. Emma had shown him what it looked like to choose love over safety, to risk heartbreak for the possibility of joy. Clara had shown him what it meant to build a life around caring for others. Together, they'd taught him that healing didn't mean forgetting the past. It meant being brave enough to believe in the future. "I want to be part of this family," Thomas said, the words coming out more directly than he'd intended. "Whatever that looks like, however that works, I want to be here." Clara's smile was soft and full of warmth. "We want that too, Thomas. All of us." Emma had apparently been listening because she rolled over in the grass and called out, "Does that mean you'll still come to dinner even after we give Chester back to his real family?" "Every night they'll have me," Thomas replied. Emma sat up, her face brightening slightly for the first time all day. "Good, because Grandma's teaching me to make tamales, and someone needs to eat them besides us." The next morning arrived too soon, and not soon enough. Thomas picked up Emma and Clara early, and they drove to the Morrison house in thoughtful silence. Emma had insisted on bringing Chester's toys and bed, carefully packed in a bag that also contained the drawing she'd made the night before. "I want them to have everything that made Chester happy while he was with us," she'd explained. When they arrived, Harold and Esther Morrison were waiting on their front porch, their faces showing the same mixture of joy and sadness that Thomas suspected was reflected in his own expression. This was right. He was certain of that, but right didn't always feel easy. Chester seemed to sense the significance of the moment. He greeted the Morrisons with obvious joy, but kept looking back at Emma and Thomas as if checking to make sure. They understood this wasn't goodbye. "We can't thank you enough," Harold said, his voice thick with emotion. "Taking him to the veterinarian, caring for him all these months, giving him so much love." "He gave us more than we gave him," Emma interrupted quietly. "He taught Mr. Thomas how to smile again, and he taught me that sometimes the best things happen when you're trying to help someone else." Esther Morrison's eyes filled with tears. "What a wise little girl you are." Emma looked down at her feet, suddenly shy. "Mrs. Morrison, could I maybe visit Chester sometimes, just to make sure he's okay and remembers us?" The relief on both elderly faces was immediate and obvious. "Oh, sweetheart, we were hoping you'd ask that," Esther said. "Chester's going to miss you terribly, and so are we. We'd love to have you visit as often as your family will allow." "And," Harold added, his eyes twinkling with something that might have been mischief, "Esther's been wanting to teach someone her famous cookie recipe. She says it's time to pass it down to a new generation." Emma's face lit up with the first genuine smile Thomas had seen from her in 2 days. "Really? You'd really?" The phone call came 3 days later, just as Thomas was opening the bookstore. For the morning routine that had become both familiar and precious, Emma's voice was different, smaller, more fragile than he'd heard it since the day they'd found Chester bleeding in the street. "Mr. Thomas, can you come to the house? Something happened to Grandma and I don't know what to do." Thomas was out the door before Emma finished speaking, leaving the shop unlocked and the register open in his haste to reach Clara's yellow house. He found Emma on the front porch, still in her pajamas, with tears streaming down her face and her small body shaking with fear. "She fell down in the kitchen," Emma said, the words tumbling out between sobs. "She was making breakfast, and then there was a big noise, and when I came running she was on the floor and she couldn't get up, and she told me to call you, but I'm scared, Mr. Thomas. I'm really scared." Thomas knelt down and pulled Emma into his arms, feeling her small form trembling against his chest. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart. Where is she now?" "Still in the kitchen. She said her leg hurts too much to move, and she looks really pale." Emma pulled back to look at him, with eyes that held too much fear for a 6-year-old. What if she has to go to the hospital like Mrs. Morrison did? What if something really bad happens to her? Thomas stood up, lifting Emma with him. "Let's go see Grandma, and then we'll figure out what she needs, okay?" Clara was indeed still on the kitchen floor, propped against the cabinet, with her left leg extended at an awkward angle that made Thomas's trained eye immediately suspicious of a fracture. Her face was pale and drawn with pain, but she managed a weak smile when she saw them. "I'm sorry to worry you both," she said, her voice steady despite the obvious discomfort. "I was reaching for something in the high cupboard and lost my balance. I think I may have broken my leg." Thomas knelt beside her, gently examining the injury, with the careful hands of someone who'd dealt with trauma before. "It looks like it. Might be fractured," he confirmed. "We need to get you to the hospital." Clara's eyes widened with something that looked like panic. "Thomas, I can't. The hospital bills, I don't have insurance that covers. We'll figure that out later," Thomas said firmly. "Right now we need to make sure you get proper medical care." Emma had been listening to this exchange with growing distress. "Grandma, you have to go to the doctor. Remember what you told me when Chester was hurt, that taking care of people you love is more important than money?" Clara's expression softened as she looked at her granddaughter. "You're right, Mija. You're absolutely right." The ambulance ride to the hospital felt like the longest journey of Thomas's life. Emma sat beside him in the emergency room waiting area, her small hand gripping his with desperate intensity, while Clara was examined and x-rayed. The diagnosis was what Thomas had feared, a complex fracture that would require surgery and weeks of recovery. "Mrs. Rodriguez is going to need extensive physical therapy," Dr. Martinez explained to them after the surgery was completed. "She'll be non-weight-bearing for at least 6 weeks, and she'll need help with daily activities for quite some time after that." Emma looked up at Thomas with eyes full of questions she was afraid to ask. Who would take care of her while Clara recovered? Where would she go? What would happen to their little family? Thomas found himself making decisions with a certainty that surprised him. "She'll stay with me," he said quietly. "Emma will stay with me while Clara recovers, and I'll make sure Clara has whatever help she needs." "Mr. Thomas," Emma whispered, "are you sure? I mean, I've never stayed overnight anywhere without Grandma before." Thomas looked down at this brave little girl who'd already faced more loss and uncertainty than most adults, and felt something fierce and protective rise in his chest. "I'm sure, Emma, we're family now, remember? Family takes care of each other." That evening, as Thomas helped Emma pack a bag of clothes and favorite books from the yellow house, he found himself marveling at how quickly life could change direction. This morning he'd been a bachelor bookstore owner whose biggest decision was what to have for dinner. Tonight he was responsible for the daily care and emotional well-being of a 6-year-old child. "Mr. Thomas?" "Eh?" Emma's voice was small and uncertain as they prepared to leave for his apartment above the bookstore. "What if I'm not good at staying at your house? What if I get scared in the night or forget to brush my teeth or make too much noise?" Thomas knelt down to her level, remembering his own childhood fears about being unwanted or too much trouble. Emma, you could never be too much trouble. And if you get scared in the night, you wake me up. If you forget to brush your teeth, I'll remind you. If you make noise, I'll probably join in. Emma managed a small smile. Really, really, we're going to take care of each other, just like you and Grandma do, just like we took care of Chester. That first night in the apartment above the bookstore was an adventure in adjustment for both of them. Emma had never slept anywhere that wasn't the yellow house, and Thomas had never been responsible for another person's bedtime routine. But somehow they muddled through. Emma in Margaret's old reading chair that Thomas had moved to the spare room, Thomas checking on her every hour until she finally fell asleep, clutching the stuffed rabbit Clara had insisted she bring. The next morning brought new challenges and small victories. Emma woke up early, disoriented but not panicked, and padded into the kitchen where Thomas was attempting to make pancakes from a box mix that was probably older than Emma herself. "Those don't look like Grandma's pancakes," Emma observed, climbing onto a chair to watch his efforts. "No, they definitely don't. Should we go get breakfast somewhere else?" Emma considered this seriously. "Could we visit Grandma first and maybe bring her some real breakfast from that place she likes on 5th Street? Thomas felt his heart expand with something that might have been pride or love or simple admiration for this child's capacity to think of others, even when her own world had been turned upside down. "That's a perfect idea," he said. "And after we visit Grandma, maybe we can stop by and see Chester. I bet the Morrisons would like to know what's been happening." Clara was sitting up in her hospital bed when they arrived, looking more like herself, despite the cast on her leg and the IV line in her arm. Her face brightened immediately when she saw Emma carrying a bag from Rosie's diner, and Thomas could see some of the worry lines around her eyes ease. "Mija, how did you sleep? Was Mr. Thomas a good host?" "He tried to make pancakes, but they looked more like hockey pucks," Emma said with the brutal honesty of childhood. "So we came to bring you real breakfast instead." Clara laughed, the first genuine laughter Thomas had heard from her since the accident. "That sounds like the right decision." As Emma unpacked containers of Clara's favorite breakfast burrito and fresh fruit, chattering about their morning adventures, Thomas found himself studying the woman who'd become so central to his life. Clara looked fragile in the hospital bed, smaller somehow, and he realized how much strength she usually projected in her daily management of their small world. "How are you really feeling?" he asked quietly, while Emma was arranging flowers they'd picked from the hospital's garden. "Scared," Clara admitted, her voice low enough that Emma wouldn't overhear. "Not about the leg, that'll heal, but about what happens next. Emma needs stability, consistency. She's been through enough disruption in her short life." Thomas pulled his chair closer to her bedside. "She's going to be fine, Clara. We're going to make sure she's fine." "Thomas, you don't understand what you're offering. Taking care of a 6-year-old is a full-time job. There are school schedules and doctor appointments and permission slips and all the daily details of raising a child. You've never—" "You're right," Thomas interrupted gently. "I've never done this before, but I've never wanted to do anything more. Emma isn't a burden, Clara. She's the best thing that's happened to me in 5 years." Clara studied his face with the careful attention she gave to all important matters. "And when I'm recovered and can take her back home, then you take her back home. But maybe—" Thomas paused, gathering courage for words he'd been thinking but hadn't dared speak. "Maybe by then we'll have figured out how to be a family all together instead of taking turns." The conversation was interrupted by Emma's discovery of something in her backpack that made her face light up with excitement. "Grandma, look what I found." She pulled out a worn photograph, the picture of Thomas with his military unit that she'd first seen weeks ago. "I brought it to show you because Mr. Thomas told me about his soldier friends, and I thought you'd like to see how brave he looked when he was young." Clara took the photograph with gentle hands, studying the faces of men who'd served together decades before Emma was born. "You were all so young," she said softly. 19, most of us, Thomas confirmed. Old enough to think we knew everything, young enough to believe we were invincible. Emma climbed onto the edge of Clara's bed, careful not to jostle the injured leg. Mr. Thomas saved people in the war just like he saved Chester. He was a medic, which is like a doctor for soldiers. Is that so? Clara's voice held new understanding. I tried to save people, Thomas corrected quietly. I didn't always succeed. Emma looked at him with the serious expression she wore when processing complex ideas. But you tried. That's what matters, right? You tried to help even when it was scary. Thomas felt his throat tighten. This child, who'd lost so much herself, was trying to comfort him about losses that had happened before she was born. Yes, he said. I tried. Later that afternoon, they visited the Morrison house as promised. Harold and Esther welcomed them, with the warmth that Thomas had come to expect from them, and Chester greeted Emma with enthusiasm that suggested he'd missed his walking partner. When they explained Clara's situation, the elderly couple's response was immediate and practical. Well, of course, Emma will stay with you, Thomas, Esther said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And of course you'll both need help figuring out this temporary parenting business. I raised 3 children, Harold added. I remember what it's like to suddenly be responsible for someone else's daily routine. There's no shame in needing guidance. Emma, meanwhile, was lying on the floor with Chester, telling him in detail about her new living situation. Mr. Thomas has lots of books but no TV, so we have to read stories for entertainment. And his refrigerator is mostly empty except for milk that might be expired. But he's learning how to take care of me, and I'm learning how to take care of him. Esther leaned toward Thomas with a conspiratorial whisper. That child has excellent instincts about what people need. Over the following days, Thomas discovered that Emma had been right. Taking care of each other was exactly what they were learning to do. Emma helped him remember to eat meals at regular times and to buy groceries that contained actual nutrients. Thomas helped Emma maintain her school routine and homework schedule, and discovered that he had more patience for reading the same bedtime story multiple times than he would have expected. The hardest moment came at the end of their first week together. Emma had been unusually quiet during dinner, picking at her food and avoiding eye contact. When Thomas finally asked what was wrong, her response broke his heart. What if Grandma likes being in the hospital better than being home with me? What if she decides she doesn't want to take care of me anymore? Thomas knelt beside Emma's chair, recognizing the fear that came from having lost the adults who were supposed to protect her once before. Emma, your grandma loves you more than anything in this world. She's in the hospital because her leg is broken, not because she doesn't want to be with you. But what if something happens to her like what happened to my parents? What if she doesn't come back? Thomas pulled Emma into his arms, feeling her small body shake with the weight of fears that were too big for someone her age to carry alone. I can't promise that nothing bad will ever happen again, he said quietly, but I can promise that no matter what happens, you'll always have someone who loves you and wants to take care of you. Even if something happened to Grandma, you'd still have me. Emma pulled back to look at him, with eyes that were too serious for a 6-year-old. Really? You'd really want to keep me forever? Forever and always, Thomas said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. That night, Emma fell asleep holding both her stuffed rabbit and Thomas's hand, and Thomas sat beside her bed long after her breathing had evened out, marveling at how completely his life had changed. A year ago, he'd been a man with no future beyond the predictable routine of solitary existence. Now he was someone's primary caregiver, someone's source of comfort and security, someone whose decisions affected another person's happiness and well-being. It should have been terrifying. Instead, it felt like coming alive. 6 months later, the spring morning that would change everything forever arrived with the kind of gentle warmth that made promises about the summer ahead. Thomas stood in the doorway of Langley's Antique Books, now officially renamed Emma and Thomas's Community Bookstore, watching his daughter help Harold Morrison hang a new sign announcing their monthly Rusty Day Animal Rescue fundraiser. Emma, officially. His daughter now, the adoption papers finalized just 2 weeks earlier, had grown taller and more confident in the month since Clara's accident. Her pigtails were still crooked most mornings, and she still asked more questions than any one person should reasonably be expected to answer. But there was a settled quality to her happiness now, a sense that she finally understood her place. The world was secure. Clara emerged from the bookstore's back room, moving carefully but steadily on her fully healed leg, carrying a tray of her famous apple turnovers for the morning's customers. The cast had come off months ago, but more importantly, the fear in her eyes had faded as she'd adjusted to her new role as Thomas's partner in both business and life. They'd married quietly in the bookstore's garden on a snowy February morning, with Emma as their flower girl and Chester as their ring-bearer, Harold and Esther Morrison as witnesses, and Dr. Chen as their photographer. The delivery from the children's publisher arrived this morning, Clara said, settling the tray on the counter that had become the social heart of their expanded bookstore. Emma's going to be thrilled. They sent twice as many books as we ordered. Thomas smiled, watching through the window as Emma demonstrated proper leash technique to a group of neighborhood children who'd been recruited as volunteer dog walkers for the animal rescue event. In the 6 months since Chester's return to his original family, Emma had become something of a local expert on animal care, and her enthusiasm had proven contagious. The transformation of both the bookstore and their lives had been gradual but profound. What had started as a simple antique bookshop had evolved into a community gathering place that hosted reading groups, offered tutoring for local children, and served as headquarters for various neighborhood improvement projects. Emma's influence could be seen everywhere, from the comfortable reading nooks she'd insisted they create, to the bulletin board covered with photos of successfully adopted rescue animals, to the jar on the counter that collected donations for families facing veterinary emergencies. "Thomas, Clara, you need to see this," Harold Morrison called from outside, his voice carrying an excitement that made them all look up. He was standing beside a small golden retriever puppy that couldn't have been more than 8 weeks old, its fur the same distinctive rusty gold color that had given Chester his temporary name. Emma dropped the leash she'd been demonstrating with and ran toward the puppy with the kind of joy that Thomas had learned meant something wonderful was about to happen. "Harold, where did this little one come from?" Clara asked, joining them on the sidewalk. Chester and Bella, the Hendersons' golden retriever from down the street, apparently became quite close friends during Chester's daily walks with Emma. Harold explained with a grin. "This little fellow is one of 5 puppies born last month. The Hendersons asked if we knew anyone who might want to adopt him." Emma was kneeling beside the puppy, who was enthusiastically trying to lick every inch of her face, while his tiny tail wagged at a speed that seemed to defy physics. "He looks just like Chester did as a baby," Emma said, her voice full of wonder. "Look at his ears. They're too big for his head, and he has that same white patch." Thomas felt Clara's hand slip into his as they watched Emma with the puppy. After months of being Chester's walking partner and honorary dog trainer for the rescue events, Emma had never asked for a dog of her own, seeming to understand instinctively that their family situation was still settling into its permanent shape. But Thomas could see in her face now the same expression she'd worn that first morning when she'd knelt beside Chester in the street. Pure, uncomplicated love. "Emma," Thomas said gently, "would you like this puppy to be part of our family?" Emma looked up at him with eyes that were bright with tears of joy. "Really, really and truly? He could live with us and sleep in my room and come to the bookstore every day. Really and truly? If you think you're ready for that kind of responsibility." Emma stood up, the puppy cradled carefully in her arms, and looked at Thomas and Clara with the serious expression she wore when making important decisions. "I think," she said slowly, "that our family has room for one more. And I think Chester would be happy to have a little brother to teach about being a good dog. As if summoned by the mention of his name, Chester appeared around the corner of the building, having escaped from Esther's supervision to investigate the commotion. When he saw the puppy in Emma's arms, his tail began wagging with the dignified approval of an elder statesman welcoming a new member to the family. "What should we name him?" Clara asked, scratching behind the puppy's oversized ears. Emma looked thoughtfully at the small golden face peering up at her with complete trust and boundless curiosity. "Chance," she said finally, "because everyone deserves a second chance to find their family, and because sometimes the best things happen when you're brave enough to help someone who needs it." That evening, after the rescue fundraiser had been declared a complete success and the last of the volunteers had gone home, Thomas found himself sitting on the front porch of the yellow house, their yellow house now, all of them together, watching Emma teach Chance his first lesson in playing fetch, while Chester supervised with patient tolerance. Clara sat beside him on the porch swing they'd installed last month, her head resting against his shoulder as they enjoyed the quiet satisfaction of a day well spent. "Do you ever think about how different everything might have been?" Clara asked softly. "If Emma hadn't found Chester that morning, if you hadn't been looking out your window at exactly the right moment." Thomas considered the question, thinking about the man he'd been just a year ago, isolated, bitter, convinced that his capacity for love had died with Margaret. Then he looked at Emma and Chance tumbling in the grass, at Chester's dignified participation in their play, at the woman beside him who'd somehow convinced him that hearts could expand rather than just break. "I think about it all the time," he said. "But then I remember what Emma taught me, that the best things happen when you stop being afraid of caring too much, when you choose to help instead of hiding." Emma looked over at them from where she was sprawled on the grass with both dogs, her face flushed with happiness and exercise. "Mr. Thomas, I mean Daddy," she called, still getting used to the new title that made Thomas's chest tighten with joy every time he heard it. "Chance wants to know if he can sleep in my room tonight. I told him he has to ask permission from the grown-ups." "What do you think, Mrs. Langley?" Thomas asked Clara, enjoying the way her face lit up at the name she was still adjusting to herself. "I think our family has always made room for creatures who need a safe place to sleep," Clara replied, as the sun set over their neighborhood, painting the sky in shades of gold that matched Chance's puppy fur. Thomas marveled at the series of small choices that had led them all to this moment. Emma's decision to help an injured dog, his decision to step outside his comfortable isolation, Clara's decision to trust a gruff stranger who'd shown kindness to her granddaughter, the Morrisons' decision to share their beloved pet instead of keeping him exclusively for themselves. Each choice had seemed small at the time, but together they'd created something none of them could have imagined, a family built not on blood or obligation, but on the radical decision to keep choosing love even when it was risky, even when it was complicated, even when it meant letting go of the familiar pain of solitude for the uncertain joy of connection. Emma ran over to the porch, Chance tucked securely in her arms and Chester trailing behind with the patience of a dog who'd learned that little. Girls and puppies required constant supervision. "I'm going to read Chance a bedtime story," she announced. "The same one you read to me, Daddy, about the velveteen rabbit who became real because someone loved him enough." Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion as he watched his daughter, head into the house with her puppy, followed by the dog who'd started it all. Clara squeezed his hand gently, understanding without words the overwhelming gratitude that sometimes left him speechless. "Come on," she said softly, standing up and tugging him toward the front door. "Let's go listen to Emma read. I love the way she does all the different voices." As they walked into the warm light of their home, Thomas thought about Margaret and the promise he'd made to keep living. He'd kept that promise in ways he never could have expected, discovering that love wasn't something you used up or lost, but something that multiplied every time you chose to share it. The last thing he heard before Emma's voice began weaving. The familiar magic of the bedtime story was Chance's contented sigh as he settled into his new life, and Chester's gentle breathing as the older dog took up his self-appointed guard position beside the child who'd saved them all. Sometimes, Thomas thought as he listened to his daughter read about toys becoming real through love, the most extraordinary transformations began with the simplest acts of kindness: a little girl's $5 sacrifice, an old man's decision to care, a community's choice to make room for love in all its unexpected forms. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, those small acts of kindness grew into something that looked exactly like home.